The prospect haunting the globe is no longer uncontrollable population expansion, but unstoppable population collapse. Now, I'm 29, and in middle school and high school, it was overpopulation, overpopulation. What happened? What happened in such a quick time frame that we are now collapsing?
Well, I would say two things. The first thing I would say is that you were being educated, if you're 29, in a very outmoded manner. The global population growth peaked about the time I was born in the 60s. By the 70s, more and more societies, including Britain and America, were going just below replacement, not much. And
Hmm.
if you actually looked at the developing world, what was happening there is the population had grown very rapidly because mortality fell, infant mortality particularly fell, life expectancy extended. And when that happens, while fertility is high and mortality falls, you get a very rapid population growth. But life expectancy only extends so long. I mean, in America, it's late 70s. Uh, India's 4 or 5 years behind America in that respect. It used to be 20 years. Compare life expectancy in Mexico and America. Again, they've converged. So first of all, mortality stops rising. And, the longest living country is perhaps Japan, somewhere like Japan, 84, maybe 85, Britain and most European countries, early 80s. So you're not going to get more growth out of people living longer. That flattens out. And then it grows once you get to the frontier. I mean, these poor countries rapidly improving child care, rapidly improving general medical care, rapidly improving the quality of the water, the availability of the food. So they quickly get a longer life expectancy, which means lower mortality, few people dying. But that flattens off as you reach the frontier. And then some period after that, how long that lag is, the fertility rate collapses. So in India, for example, maybe when I was born, it was perhaps 6 or 7 children per woman. That was true of Mexico. Mexico now, the latest data is probably has a lower fertility rate than the US. Many states in India have below replacement. India as a whole now has below replacement. So you're just going through a process that should have been predictable to people like Paul Ehrlich in the 60s, because that's what had happened in Europe and America. It had very, very rapid growth. We hadn't got our mortality rates down that quickly. We
Hmm.
were finding our way. We were driving our path through the jungle. But countries like China and India, they were rapidly catching up because we had the technologies, we had the medicine, and so on. So if you're 29, you were being miseducated. You were being educated in a worldview that was already 20, 30, 40 years out of date. So that's the first thing I would say.
Mm.
The other thing I would say is people have expressed great consternation. 1 minute, demographers are saying population growth is too rapid. The next minute, they're saying it's going down. I mean, when you say the next minute, we are talking about a shift from the worldview of Paul Ehrlich, let's say, to the worldview of Paul Morland. Not that I'm anything like the only person talking about this any more than Ehrlich was. Um, that's sort of 60 years. I mean, I'm 61 and Ehrlich's book came out, I think, when I was a toddler or small child. So, if an economist says to you the economy is overheating, we've got to raise interest rates, we've got an inflation threat, and 3 or 4 years later they say to you, oops, we've overshot the mark, we're going into a depression, we need to, that's kind of accepted for economics.
Mhm.
But somehow people expect that once they've been told something about demography, it can never change. And they kind of are outraged when you
Mm.
tell them the opposite, and contradict something that was written 60, 70 years ago.
Mhm. Why is it, do you think, I mean, it's getting more traction, more popularity, people are hearing about population decline and its negative effects. Why do you think it's so slow to be adopted and accepted both by policy changes and by just the population?
That's a very good question. I think there are a number of answers to that. The first is that people get lazy and they just say, oh, that's what we learned in the 60s, so
Mm.
that's what we should learn now. The second is that it's a sensitive topic. You can offend all sorts of shibboleths and all sorts of sacred cows if you
Mm.
start talking about why we need to have more children. And, my book, No One Left, which I think you read, there's a chapter about why this should not be an offense to feminists,
Mhm.
and why technology is not the answer. So it's a whole range of responses. So it's sensitive as well. It's not obvious what to do about it. And then there's another point which is slightly technical, which is when your fertility rate goes below replacement, your population can continue growing. So Britain, for example, went below replacement fertility in the early 70s, along with a lot of the world, including the States, although a lot of countries like Britain and America just went below for a long period, whereas Japan went a long way below. And that's had big implications, which we may talk about. But while that happens, if you think of your population pyramid, you've had a lot of people dying young in previous generations. So few old people, lots of young people. So lots of young people are having not that many children. You still have more births than deaths until gradually the population pyramid changes its shape. And then you have lots of old people who were then the young parents, and they don't have many offspring. So, for example, in the UK, we got below replacement fertility in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and we didn't have more deaths than births until last year or the year before. So it also takes a while to work through. And as a society, if you're lacking kids or lacking teenagers, the government can save a bit on education, maybe a few schools close, but it's not dramatic. It really gets dramatic when you start having not enough young workers. So it takes time to work through to have really bad implications. But once you've built it in, you've built it in. So hopefully that answers the question about why it's taking people quite a long time to catch up.
I've been hearing the phrase silver tsunami. What does that mean?
Well, I've never heard the phrase before, but you're probably living in Colorado, a bit more close to the place where such phrases are
The zeitgeist.
crafted. Yes, yes, California or somewhere like that. I suppose what it means is that if I say we, I mean baby boomers. So I was born in the middle of November 1964. I'm a baby boomer by these, but according to UK definitions of baby boom, the baby boom stops in 64. I'm 65. You're on to the next thing. So we are now almost all over. Well, we are all over 60, which is the age people start retiring, and we're a very, very large cohort. I mean, I'm actually looking at the data today. 1964 was the peak year of British births. So when you think that the population is so much bigger now, the fertility rate is about half what it was back in 64. So we've got this large cohort of retirees. And instead of, if we had had enough children on average, the fact that you've got a big fat top of the population pyramid wouldn't matter because you'd have an even larger base to it. And that means that people would be working, people would be paying taxes, people would be working in old age homes, supporting older people, and an absolutely large number of old people would not be a problem. The problem is that those of us born between the baby boom, which really got going shortly after the Second World War, and the mid-60s are a very large cohort. We haven't replaced ourselves. We expect very expensive healthcare, which in many countries is provided through the state. And I know in the States as well, you've got, I can't remember if it's Medicare or Medicaid, but a lot of older people, maybe all older people get that support. You've got old age pensions, which may be financed personally or through the state again. But one way or another, we're quite a heavy burden on society. Now, I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm not in favor of finishing off the elderly. I think longer life expectancy, the better, particularly if it's a healthy, positive life. But if a generation, a cohort has had longer and longer life expectancy, but has not taken the trouble to replace itself with an average of 2 or 3 children per couple on average, then that creates great strains on the economy and on government finances and a whole range of other things.
Real quick, I just wanted to interrupt this conversation and say it is not lost on me how lucky I am each and every day to get to have these conversations. And I hope you guys, as the listeners, know how much I appreciate the time that you take out of your day to listen to these conversations. And I hope you get as much value out of listening to them as I did creating them. If I could just ask one quick favor, it helps so much for shows like mine if you like, subscribe, comment, do all those things. That helps the algorithm know and realize that there's value here and pushes it to more listeners. And by doing that, that allows me to get even bigger guests, more well-known guests, and have more conversations for you guys. I appreciate what you do so much. I appreciate the time that you take to listen to these conversations so much. I couldn't be here without you guys. Thank you. Now let's get back to the conversation. Can we just define fertility rate and replacement rate? What do those mean?
Yeah. Okay, well, I think if you look at the birth rate and the death rate,
Hmm.
and I've got an appendix on this in my book, The Human Tide, to which I would refer people. But if you look at the death rate and the birth rate, that's very easy. How big is the population? How many people were born or died? What's the percentage? And that's a very simple, crude figure. Um, the problem with that is it doesn't tell you that much because it doesn't take two countries with 1 million people each, say. Imagine they had the same number of births. So that would be the same X over Y that have the same birth rate. But in one, they've got loads and loads for reasons of past demography, loads and loads of young men and women. And the other one, they don't have that many young men and women, but they're producing the same number of children. Then the one with not many young men and women, it's obviously got a higher fertility rate. So what you actually, and I'm going to put this in very crude terms. Imagine, forget those two countries. Imagine another country where you had about 1 million women, and it's judged by the statistics are formed by women, but I think we need to be very careful to remember that this is not a woman issue. This is a human issue, and just because the statistics are um, created per woman, that doesn't mean it. We need to make sure we don't overemphasize that in terms of thinking where the problem is. But anyway, imagine you have 1 million women and say fertility lasts for 30 years very roughly, um, then you could say, okay, if that 1 million women had 100,000 babies in a given year, so this year we've got about 1 million women who are fertile and they have 100,000 babies. Theoretically, if 1 million women create 100,000 babies, that's one baby for every 10 years, and they're fertile for 30 years. The fertility rate's 3. Now, it's slightly more complicated than that because you look at different ages and so on. But roughly, so what it says is if you look at the fertile population of women now, this year, or over a 5 year, and we look at how many children they actually had, how many children would the average woman have over her life expectancy, over her fertile life? So that's a much better measure than just a crude birth rate will tell you how many people are being born relative to population. A fertility rate looks at the actual number of people of fertile years and then says, well, if that's the experience in that year, how many and okay, so that's fertility. I'll come back to replacement rate. And similarly, there's a very crude measure for mortality, which is how many deaths per 100,000. Now, imagine you looked at the deaths per 100,000 or per thousand. Sorry, it's normally expressed per thousand, but that's just a technicality. Imagine you looked at a very young society, a very old society, or imagine you looked at a school and an old age home. If the school and the old age home had the same number of deaths per thousand, well, you wouldn't expect. So the point is that the life expectancy looks at the age of a society and says, how long will you actually live? So you would expect Japan to have a higher mortality rate than, say, a young country like South Africa, because, yes, South Africans die younger than Japanese, but not that much. But there are loads of young people in South Africa, not that many old people. Japan is full of old people. So if you simply looked at the deaths per thousand, you'd expect it to be much, much higher in Japan. But if you actually do a slightly more complicated mathematical calculation, which looks at how long, if you're born now in Japan, based on existing mortality tables, how long you could expect to live, that tells you you'd expect to live to about 84, 85. And expect to live longer than. So in both cases, mortality and fertility, you've got a very crude, simple measure per thousand of the population. And then you've got something that adjusts to look at the people who you'd expect to be dying or the people you'd expect to be having children and look at how high the rate of dying or having children is. Now, if absolutely everybody lived to 50, say, nobody died before 50, then if every couple has 2 children, then 2 people are replaced in the long term by 2 children. And growth of population, forgetting immigration, which is a separate subject, if you had a closed system, the growth of the population would simply be driven by slightly lengthening life expectancy. If life expectancy stops growing and everyone has 2 children, then the population will eventually stabilize. The
Mm.
reason you need more than 2 is because not everybody makes it to 50. Now, imagine you have a society like many, many societies before the modern era, where perhaps 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 children die before the age of 1, and perhaps as many as 2/3 of children die before they are able or ready to have children of their own. Now, in
Mhm.
such a society, you could see that if everyone had, say, 3 children and only one made it to have children of their own, 2 people would make 1 people, the population would halve in every cohort. So the extent to which you need a replacement level above 2 is the extent to which people die off before they've completed their whole fertility period.
Mhm.
Even if people die during it, they only got made a start. Now, because in today's world, in most societies, increasingly, even in the developing world, the mortality rate of children is very, very low. Thank goodness for that. And indeed, the vast majority of people make it through to the age that they complete their fertility. 2 is almost enough, but there are always going to be some people who die before they get there. So if you're looking at a modern society, something over 2, slightly over 2, will give you a long term. If you had no immigration, and eventually stabilizing life expectancy, then the population would, in the long term, stabilize if the fertility rate were a little above 2. Now, because in most countries, I mean, in the States, you have, for a very wealthy country, exceptionally high infant mortality, but it's still very low and not very long life expectancy, actually, for a very wealthy country. But if you look at a country like the States or Britain or Japan, the differences in these things are quite small. And in all of them, if you had a fertility rate of 2, frankly, the extent to which the population would decline would be vanishingly small. So in most
Mhm.
modern societies where vast majority of people are making it through to 50, say, um, a fertility rate of 2 is as good as replacement. Now, the other thing I should say when you're thinking about replacement rates is its fertility rate always measured per woman. Because the woman gives birth to the child, women's fertility ends earlier than men, so it's easier to say how many children per fertile woman. And of course, you never in doubt who the mother is. Now, in a society like China, take China as a very good example, or indeed India, they have at certain periods had selective abortions where people have preferred to have sons. And if
Mhm.
they know they're having a daughter, they've aborted them. I mean, not everybody by any means, but you've got in the cohort of fertile people, you've got a predominance of men over women. That's another reason why you'd need higher than 2. So if you have
Mhm.
2, a country like China, long life expectancy, very low infant mortality, 2 would kind of do it. But if it's 2 per woman, but there's an excess number of men, then you're going to need a little over 2 just to compensate from that, or maybe quite a bit over 2. But in a society with a balance of men and women, where life expectancy is more or less stable, and almost everybody lives to 50, replacement of rate of 2 is as, it'll do.
Mm. What is the current fertility rate of the globe and of, like, specific Western countries like the States or UK?
So the globe is about at replacement level. It's about 2 today, a little over 2. The data's coming in. We may find we're very close to the year where the global fertility rate goes below 2. So China, if I think of some of the big players, China is probably not much above 1. That means every cohort of Chinese is going to halve. That means like more than half the population of China is almost inevitably going to disappear. The population of China by the end of the century will be about half or less than what it is today. So I mean that's pretty shocking.
Yeah, that is.
And in Japan, for example, there's also a question of how long it's been low, because that's kind of how much you've baked in. Japan, which is a bit over 100 million people, is losing quite a bit over, I can't remember, 110, 120. It's losing a million a year more deaths than births, just from deaths over birth. That will obviously eventually slow just because the population gets smaller. Um, the United States and Britain and much of the Anglosphere had a very good post-war boom that wasn't so big in continental Europe. And we and the Scandinavian countries and France, to some extent Benelux, I think, as well, kept it not that much below 2 for quite a long time. So we've got a reasonable number of young people, right? It's not a
Mhm.
disaster. Now we're going down. I mean, the last I saw of Britain, it was below 1.4. I think the States is probably a little bit higher than that. Um, Countries like Germany, which is not necessarily that much lower, but they went lower for a long time in the 70s, the 80s, and so on, the 90s. So they built in a worse structure.
Mm.
And the shocking thing now is that you've got really quite poor countries. So in the past, you could say, tell me how urbanized, how educated, and how wealthy a country is, and I'll tell you what its fertility rate is. In fact, the next book I'm writing is coming out in November called Bust, The Economics of Population Decline. I actually do some statistical analysis. And I say, let's look at 1970. What's the correlation between GDP per capita and fertility? And it's a good correlation. So if you said to me in 1970, I want to know a country's fertility rate. Tell me one piece of data. I would say GDP per capita. Imperfect though that is as a measure for all sorts of reasons. You adjust it for PPP, etc. Not getting into all of that, but broadly that was a good measure. Literacy rates, that was all a good measure. It's very materially driven. How far are you through this process of getting your populated, educated, urban, wealthy, and that's your fertility rate goes down accordingly. Now we're in an era where that relationship is broken, and so many countries that are still quite poor have got quite low fertility. So India's made fantastic economic progress over the last 30 years. It's still a very poor rural and country with reasonably high illiteracy, and yet now it's at replacement. So as it continues to develop, as it gets more urban, educated, and wealthy, how low is it going to go? And we know certain Indian states, Kerala, West Bengal, are I think Tamil Nadu is not much better, are well below replacement, have been for ages. Countries like Chile, countries like Thailand are not that much above one child per woman. And that, again, that means, that now they're going to be short of kids and teenagers. In 20 years, they're going to be short of young workers. And then eventually their population's just going to start going down the tube effectively, halving every 25, or each cohort will halve 25, 30 years. South Korea, it's picked up a little bit. But again, I mean, I did a very simple calculation at the level of fertility that South Korea was at a few years ago, and it's gone up a little bit. 100 people of one cohort would make 40 people of the next cohort, would make 16 of the next cohort. So you kind of lose 84% over half a century, 50, 60 years.
Yeah. So per 100 grandparents, there would be
Well,
16
100 people
grandkids.
of the grandparents'
Correct.
generation, because lots of
Correct.
them won't be grandparents. It becomes 40 because
Yeah.
you've got a fertility rate of maybe 0.75 per couple. So 2 becomes 0.75, 1 becomes, etc. So that how quickly. And I think because all that, the fertility rate at this level is newish.
Mm.
So we haven't, and we won't for a while see the effect of this,
Yeah.
this, but it's come. And Japan, because Japan's got a low fertility rate below replacement when the rest of us did, but it went much lower for longer. You're beginning to see that in Japan, where they're losing 1 million people every year.
Mm.
Japan's another good example. I cite Japan because it's just longer ahead on this path than the
Mhm.
others, but we all seem to be drifting there, with a few notable exceptions we may come to. Japan, this is one of the problems in Japan. If you look at the ratio of 20 to 65-year-olds, people broadly in the working population, to over 65s, that ratio was about 8 or 9 to 1 when Japan went up to 100 million people in the 60s. When it goes
Mhm.
back down below 100 million in 20 or 30 years, probably 20, um, instead of 8 or 9 to 1, it will be a little over 1 to 1.
Mm.
So instead of 8 or 9 people looking after that small number of old people, you're going to have 1 to 1. And
1.
that has huge implications we've already kind of discussed on tax and how basically how a society and economy supports itself when it has one. Now moving the one retiree per worker or something like that, moving the retirement day, getting people to work a bit later, is going to make very little difference compared
Mhm.
to moving from an 8 to 1 to a 1 to 1 ratio.
I was listening to, I can't remember who it was. It was another demographer talk about the implication or the effect that this would have on war as well. Because if your population is declining, your country is never going to be as powerful as it is now in terms of just total manpower, and that incentivizes, expansion and war.
Well, there are people who draw big geostrategic implications from all of this. I think Peter Zion is one,
Mm.
and there are other people who I think. So there's some interesting work by, I think, Jackson and Howes, I can't remember, some time ago, which said that to be a strong power in the long term, this is a really important issue,
Hmm.
and that America, with what was a relatively high fertility rate, um, and the ability to import people effectively and turn them into Americans, if that's what you want to do, was had a great advantage over, say,
Hmm.
China and Russia, which had didn't have that immigration potential and had much lower fertility rates. And I think that's right now. Now the idea, oh, China's going to collapse in terms of its population, therefore it will have to go for Taiwan in this period of time. I don't, I think those are, really interesting discussions to think about what will motivate China to go for Taiwan or not, and what role demography plays. But I don't think you can simply read one off from the other. The way I put it is, if you knew absolutely every fact about European or world demography in 1925,
Hmm.
you couldn't have predicted World War II. So, whilst I think demography is my second book, The Human Tide, How Population Shaped the Modern World, is really an argument for thinking seriously about the implications of population for history.
Hmm.
History gets written backwards. And I'm not sure I'm not someone who likes to make very grandiose claims about the geostrategic implications of demography. What I would say, though, is generally there's another aspect, which is as societies age, they become, and I'm all in favor of higher fertility and worrying about population decline and aging, but aged societies are less likely to go to war,
Mm.
and they are also less likely to be violent and criminal. And this is one of the reasons the Russian Ukrainian war is so very unusual. Um, in our lifetimes, most of my lifetime, most of the wars, most of the deaths in war, most of the violent conflict has been in relatively young countries. So it's interesting, for example, as Northern Ireland got older, the conflict lost some of its passion.
Mm.
Fertility rates came down, life expectancy extended. I can't tell you off the top of my head how what the median age in Northern Ireland is now compared to, say, the mid 70s, but it's considerably older.
Mm.
Similarly, in the Balkans, I mean, the Balkans was quite young and volatile in the 1990s, and a very low fertility rate. I think Bosnia at one point had the lowest fertility rate in Europe, and therefore rapidly aging. And whilst the Bosnia is still a bit of a problem, it seems unlikely to me that it will uh, become a hot conflict given the age structure. Not
Mhm.
impossible. We think of wars essentially happening in places like Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda and Sudan, and places that are very young and have lots and lots of volatile young people. And there are, of course, exceptions, and the Russia-Ukraine war would be one. But whilst I think it's perfectly valid as a historian or social scientist to look at how these things operate backwards and to draw some interesting conclusions about the future. But I'm very suspicious of making too grandiose claims about
Yeah.
the impact of demographic structures on war and peace and geostrategy more generally.
If you think about it, it would be the countries that have people in power for a long amount of time, like China, like Russia, that are able to even make these kind of plays. Because over here in the States, I mean, you have the 4-year cycle where all it seems to be is that the presidential candidate is like thinking about either their next 4 years where they can, do something, or if it's their last 4 years that they can do it, just like this is my legacy and I need to make all the change that I can in this next 4 years. So the countries that would be able to plan that far ahead and think, okay, my population is going to go down and do that is going to be those countries that have those dictators or those people who are in control for a significant amount of time. When it comes to cultural like policy, and then even now I've been talking to a lot of health and wellness and neuroscientists and things like that. When it comes to the actual human anatomy and the biology of male and female, it seems like we have less viable sperm, less viable eggs, there's microplastic, there's a whole host of things that would contribute. Where do you lay the most blame?
Well, I don't lay very much at the biology. So that we talk about total fertility rate. Fertility for demographers is simply how many children are born. And
Mm,
then we say, well, why aren't they being born? Now, that may have a biological component, but it
mhm,
may be in a world of contraception or choice. So let's just kind of work back. Um, there's quite a lot of controversy about the sperm count, and there
mhm,
are different views about whether it's real, number one, and whether it matters at this point. In other words, the sperm count is still, for the vast majority of people, high enough to conceive fairly rapidly. And the best data that I have seen is at a given age, not very good data, but at a given age, people I know who are involved in the industry, it's kind of as likely that you'll conceive in a given period as it would have been in previous generations. If more people are having problems, biologically, it's because more people are leaving it till later. Now, that's not to say that the sperm count problem isn't necessarily real and that we could get below some kind of critical mass and then it becomes a big problem. But at the moment, the main constraint is not biological, it would seem. And if most people at a reasonable age engage in reasonably regular sexual activity, then I don't think it's all that different from how it's ever been. I'll just give you one little anecdote on the sperm count issue. I have a friend whose parents used to run a fertility clinic, and her father, who's no longer with us, he made a really interesting comment to me, which I've never heard anyone else make, but I will share it. Which he said, and he's dead now, and he was quite old. He was doing this back in the 70s and maybe the 60s, I don't know. He said when he started, if there was a problem, men would not accept it could possibly be them, and they often would not get tested. They would
mhm,
say, "No, no, it must be my wife. I'm a real man. Now attitudes have changed, and so it may be that as attitudes have changed, the sperm that gets tested increasingly is the sperm of people. So that's one possible theory that
mhm,
would suggest it's not. I'm not a biologist, so I'm not definitively saying there is no problem with sperm count, but it does seem to be um, the data. Some people question the data, and also whatever the data, most men have got plenty of sperm count now to be
mm,
able to conceive with a suitable partner. So okay, so that's not why people are having fewer children. What are the reasons? And this is a really complicated thing because you look along the spectrum about causality. See, well, people are using contraception, but why are they using contraception? So that's one thing. Is it, and you can broadly put this into two buckets: material and cultural. So the material is, oh, we can't afford to start a family, we can't afford a home, we can't afford childcare, and the woman wants to pursue a career. And those are all very valid things. We're much richer as a society than we were when we had a much higher fertility rate, even back in the 70s, say, when contraception was generally acceptable, available, we still had a significantly higher fertility rate. So um, I don't think it's just the availability of contraception. The thing is what's motivating people to use contraception, and there are economic issues there. We are richer, but we have higher expectations, and also it is harder, I think, in many ways to get started. I think wages. You look at wages, and they may be higher, but for young people, they're not necessarily higher. Housing is certainly very expensive. There's a whole range of things to do with economics. Still, Koreans in the 50s had perhaps 5 children, and they were perhaps 1/20th as wealthy as they are now. So if you say, well, they're 20 times better off and now they can't afford to have children, something's wrong. So
mhm,
I tend to put more emphasis on the cultural issues, and the
mm,
culture is a um, very broad term. What do we actually mean? And what we mean is different things in different places. So there's definitely been some kind of breakdown in relationship between the sexes. People are dating less, people are having less sex than they did sort of
mhm,
30, 40 years ago. They're becoming sexually active later. Um, and more people are saying they don't want children, although people still on average say they want 2 to 3 in most developed countries. So there's a whole range of reasons why people are not having children, and I think they vary across countries. In some places, so for example, in India, people not getting married is very unusual, and people get married quite young. They're still not having very large families. In other countries, Korea, for example, reasonably patriarchal countries, which at the same time allow women to have good educations, but then don't encourage them into the workplace as mothers or don't support them. That seems to be a particularly bad, and also relationships are breaking down. Perhaps there are some societies in which the expectation of women is to have a more educated man, and the expectation of men is to have a less educated woman. Hypergamy, it's called. So that kind of worked when men were getting educations and women weren't. But now they're on an even par, and the men are still looking for less educated women, and the
Mm,
women looking for more educated men. In fact, I've got a friend who's Singaporean who I met at Oxford back in the 80s. And when she went back to Singapore, they were really keen to get the graduates together because they were quite, I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was quite eugenicist. But there were among the better educated Singaporean men, and it's not the most patriarchal society, men who didn't necessarily want a highly educated wife. And many of the girls who'd been to, Oxford or Harvard or Cambridge or wherever were not going to settle for a less educated man. So that can be a problem. So the problem is not that women are getting great educations. I'm all in favor of that. The problem is in some societies that makes for a mismatch in terms of what people expect. So I could go on all day on the various sort of national, local, ethnic and religious differences.
mhm,
But I think if we really want to understand the fall in global fertility, biology at this point will not give us many answers.
mm,
Economics will give us answers, but it's a lot to do with expectations, and expectations are shaped by culture. So I think if you really want to understand it and dig into it, it's going to be varied by country and by region. And it's a sort of strange phenomenon which is global but has local, global phenomenon with local roots. I mean, just to give you another example, there's really interesting work been done in Brazil, and I understand it's been done in India as well, where they actually looked at the spread of not of so much of television, but of soap operas. And in Brazil's got famous soap operas of glamorous people getting in and out of flashy cars with jewelry and nice apartments and so on. And people suddenly started aspiring, not that they could necessarily aspire to that level, but people perhaps became more material in their aspirations
mm,
and less interested in having large numbers of children, because that kind of got in the way, both in terms of time and money. There's been some really interesting recent work by an acquaintance of mine at the FT, the Financial Times. I wrote an article about it in the Telegraph about the spread of smartphones and the fall of fertility. And
mm,
even if you make a good correlation there, it still begs the question: well, why? What is it about smartphones? Is it that people are spending their time not meeting people in real life? Is it pornography or distractions, or the fact that in a world of social media, women and men tend to diverge politically? Because there's also a political aspect to this. In the States, there's good data that shows not only do the religious have larger families, but the conservatives have larger families. If you look at the counties where people supported Trump versus I think it's probably the first Biden Trump, or the Biden Trump election um, of 2020, 2019, whenever that was. Um, the counties which were very Trumpy had much higher fertility rate than the count. And that, we were talking beforehand, I've just been in Utah, not the highest fertility in the States anymore, but obviously with that Mormon tradition, there's still a relatively high fertility rate. And if you go to the big cities in the States, urban areas are very low fertility.
mm. I'm curious how much of uncertainty plays into all of this. Like I was saying, we were talking before, my wife's in medical school, and with just the rise of AI and just like these big claims of tech CEOs and job loss and everything that's going on, it's like I showed my wife this conversation that Elon Musk had. Like he literally just, my wife's in medical, she wants to be a surgeon, and Elon Musk just said, it was like, hey, if I was in medical school right now, he's like I'd be scared. He's like, you're gonna have access to autonomous robots that are gonna be like the best healthcare. Now, historically, Elon's quite a bit ahead on his timelines, but he's usually, it comes down the pipeline. And so we had that conversation. It's like, well, what's going on? Like, what are we going to do here? How's AI going to play into this? Like, is there any security? And I'm just curious your opinion on that affecting people's decisions to have kids as well.
I think there are two aspects of worth talking about when it comes to AI. One is it giving rise to precariousness that is depressing fertility rates? And the second is it going to be the solution to having not large enough families? It's interesting that Elon Musk both talks about the disaster of low fertility rates and at the same time thinks we're all going to be replaced. So, I mean, I'll leave him to answer that, although I do have my own answer, which I'll come to at the end. So, um, there's always reasons to be precarious and uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
At times of high employment, we still see fertility rates going down. I'm skeptical that I think this is disruptive, but I'm skeptical that, you may remember there's a chapter in my book about this, why this time is different. So we always,
Mm-hmm.
I talk about the machine smashers, the Luddites, the very early 19th century in Britain, who said, "Well, look, we're losing our job in the countryside. Now these machines are going to do all the work. What future do we have?" And then along came the Industrial Revolution, well, it was underway already. And actually, the industry needed the creation of a mass industrial working class, and the more people, the more jobs. I also talk about the number of horses in London, which I think was several 100,000, but in the turn of the century, 1900, and within a few decades had gone down massively as the motor car had arrived. And all those people who built stables and cared for the horses and drove the horses and grew the forage, we didn't have we did have a period of mass unemployment. It had nothing to do with that. So this time is different. I was in the workplace in the 80s and we were told about, along comes something called the PC and then the internet. So I'm a bit skeptical. I'm particularly skeptical about, so certainly AI is going to take certain sorts of jobs. It will enhance certain sorts of jobs.
Mm-hmm.
It will change certain sorts of jobs, but I'm a bit skeptical in the long term it's really going to replace people. I think the state of robotics today, so the state of actually the hands-on kind of things that people do, I think it will take quite a long time if it ever happens. So I understand, I hear about driverless cars, but I've been hearing about them for ages, and I think in San Francisco you can get in one, but you
You
can't
can
in London yet.
I mean, I've got a 2025 Tesla, and I'll get into
Right.
that, and I don't touch the steering wheel, like, ever. I
Really?
just put in my
Right.
destination, and it just takes me there, and it's
Okay.
becoming less nanny body, so it used to be, like, it'd beep at me if I was, like, down on my phone, but
Yeah.
now it's like, "Hey, man, do your thing," so I'm just, like, I'm doing work in my car while it's taking me there,
Right, that's
and
amazing. So we have got there clearly, but my
yeah,
goodness, I was hearing about that 20 or 30 years ago. So,
yeah.
all those taxi drivers eventually are gonna have to find other things to do. But there's at the same time, we're short of labor in all sorts of areas. I mean, not least today. I mean, today, for example, having been away for quite a long time, I went to see my 92-year-old mother in a care home. And then, as I mentioned to you after this podcast, I'm gonna pick up my 2 local grandchildren from their nursery. And these are very labor intense areas where I'm not convinced the technology is really going to make all that much difference. So I think there's lots to do. But the last thing I would say on this technology subject is even if, um, if it really does replace labor, we're going to need to find a new kind of economic settlement because
Mhm.
all the returns will be to capital, and then there'll be no one to spend any money. So I'm very anti the minimum wage, the sort of living wage, whatever it is that everybody gets, even if they don't work. But if we really do end up in a world where there's no work, then that will have to some kind of system will be necessary. But even if we end up in a world where we don't have to work, where we don't need to have children to produce the labor force of the future because the robots and AI are going to do all that, it's not a world I would welcome to think that we will be a declining, shrinking old age home surrounded by beautiful technology, wiping our bottoms and putting us to bed. That's not the future for humanity that I would aspire to.
With this issue of population decline, the solution seems to be it rests on the shoulders of the young and the people in the childbearing. But if the people aren't educated on the potential downfalls of this population decline, like I'm like I said, I'm 29. My wife's 26. We've got a lot of friends who are in their earlier mid and late 20s, and if I talk to them and I brought this up, I was like, hey, what do you think of population decline? The gut response is like, that sounds great, like more resources to go around, the world's not as taxed, you know. The initial response is like, oh, this will be better for me and my kids. That doesn't seem to be the case talking about this though, right?
Well, resources. There's a American economist no longer with us, sadly, called Julian Simon. You may have heard of him,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource. The ultimate resource is the human brain. So when there were 1 billion people on the planet around the year 1800, the vast majority lived, a couple of meals away from starvation.
Mm-hmm.
Most people were farmers. They had very basic technology, and they lived in kind of Malthusian conditions. We read about the wealthy in Jane Austen, for example, but they were a small share of the population. Most people were living hand to mouth
Mm-hmm.
effectively. When we got to 2 billion and then 4 billion and then 8 billion, we lived better and better. So at 8 billion people plus, we've never had more food per capita. We've never had more education. We've never had longer life expectancy. We've never had lower infant mortality. And I mean, another anecdote I'll give is that when I was in my early 20s, I went to India, 1985. And the population of India, I think, is probably roughly doubled since then. I mean, the fertility rate's gone down, but in that period, they had a high fertility rate. They've extended their life expectancy. Indians are vastly better. So I went back about 10 years ago. One of my daughters won a scholarship, and I went with her for a week around Rajasthan. I mean, still a poor country, but the absolute massive leap you could see was extraordinary, and you can see that in the data again. If you look at Indian life expectancy and infant mortality, and as the population's grown, I mean, I went on the trains in the 80s, then I went on the trains in the mid 2010s, a completely different experience. And as an acquaintance of mine, Lyman Stone, who you may have heard of, who talks about a lot about this, I think he put it very well. He said, India's not overpopulated, it's under infrastructured. I
Mm.
think so. As there are more of us, we come up with more brilliant ideas, we interconnect more, we urbanize, we're better educated, we're much more productive. And so that's not to say I want a world with 16, 32, 64 billion people. I think I would be satisfied if we could kind of level off at around 8.
Mm-hmm.
um, which we would do if today's global fertility rate stabilized. But of course, it's falling. And also, as I often say, this isn't just a human problem, it's a national problem. Even if it's stabilized globally, but some countries like Korea were losing 2/3 of their cohort every cohort. There's
Mm-hmm.
not a great compensation to Korea that people are having kids somewhere else in the world. So I do think it's a national problem as well. But I think it's an absolute illusion to think that as there are fewer people, life is going to get better. You want to go to places like the Japanese or the Greek countryside where the village empties out, the last school shuts, the last old person's living alone in their house in the village. The small town, which was a centre of vibrant villages, no longer the villages of me much. The small town's decaying. It's not worth. You can't justify building, keeping the roads up. There's no longer a flight to the national capital that there used to be. I mean, it's a story of human decline. As the population declines in a city, think of Detroit. I know Detroit's probably turned the corner, but streets end up being empty and rot.
Mm-hmm.
The shops shut down. Try running a business when every year the basic background foundation is your customer base shrinks, shrinks, shrinks,
Mm-hmm.
shrinks. It's always shrinking. The whole of economics. This is the basis of my next book, Bust the Economics of Population Decline. The whole of economics is kind of based on a normal population pyramid with steady population growth. The government won't be able to afford to finance your pension. There won't be anyone to look after you when you're old, etc., etc. So I think superficially people may think it will be nice when there are just fewer people around. I mean, I think the trouble is people lead urban lives and they think, oh, the world's so crowded, but it's not crowded. If you fly into London, for example, Heathrow Airport's quite near the centre of London. But if you fly to Gatwick or Luton or Stansted, which are like the 3 other major airports, And they're all places where if you lived, you could commute into the centre of London daily and work. It's fields, it's huge open fields. I spend most of my life in London. I travel quite a lot. I've got a house in the Eastern Pyrenees in France.
Mm,
And believe you me, there is an awful lot of open space, and we can go for walks 2, 3 hours and see nobody. If people elect to live in cities, and there are good reasons they do, then they feel that the world's overcrowded. But in fact, there's plenty of space,
mm,
and a world of declining population will be a world of aging and labor shortages and closing schools and closing businesses and shuttered shops, and
hmm.
it won't be pleasant. And I hope people will think about that rather than just have to experience it.
Yeah, yeah. It's I mean, the case that you're making there, and you're completely right. Like we do live urban lives. Like I'm outside of Denver, and because my wife's going to school here, and people do go to these cities, and we see this traffic, and we see all these people, and we think, oh, there's a lot of people, but it's not. It's the small towns. Like people leave the small towns, and then the small towns decay and lose, and the last thing that's going to stick around is these big metropolitan and these big urban cities. But and I completely agree with what you're saying as well, is like with the decline in global population, we might be missing out on the next, Einstein, Shakespeare, Beethoven, whatever that is, because we're not, giving more human life and more chance to flourish. But that idea also doesn't help, the 25 to 35-year-old who is still paying rent or still with his parents, who had this idea of like, my dad bought a home when he was like 25 and he was able to have all these kids. They feel like they need to establish themselves first before they can then bring in life.
Well, I think this is where both you need to think about the interrelationship of the cultural and the material. So all these material things matter. So do expectations. Like, what do you expect before you even start? Do you have to have paid off a mortgage, right? I mean, do you
Mm-hmm.
have to have at what point? Well, like when we started our family, I was a postgraduate student. Um, and we were living in a rented flat. I'm not saying, oh, everyone has to do what I did, but there is a question about expectations. But I think very realistically, in countries, the States is still a country with relatively light expectations from the government. But in a welfare state like Britain, I think it's really important that we re-establish the way that things work to make it more affordable for young families to get started. That we lighten the tax burden on the young, particularly if they have children. That we loosen the planning restrictions to allow more houses to be built.
Mm,
Um, and we continue to subsidise and maybe subsidise further childcare to allow women to go into the workplace without feeling they have to do one or the other. So I think there is a whole set of things that we could and should do. Some of them quite market related solutions. I'm not someone who says the government has to intervene everywhere. Loosening planning restrictions, for example,
mm-hmm.
cutting taxes on the young, for example, not putting up the pensions so fast for the older people. The whole range of things is not necessarily interventionist. Some of them are anti-interventionist. But I think the way certainly the European welfare state works at the moment, most countries, is it's very generous to older people, and it weighs heavily on the young, who should be creating the population, the economy of the future.
Paint the picture for me 25 years from now for places like Japan, and then again places like the UK and the States. What are we expecting if nothing changes?
Well, let me paint it for Japan, and then you just say, we'll just be 20, 30 years behind.
Fair
So
enough.
first of all, you'll end up with instead of Japan today, it's about 2 workers per retiree. You'll end up with about 1 per 1. The median age, if you lined up the whole population, how old would the person be in the middle? Would be over 50. I think it's right to say Japan's heading. I mean, when I was born, the median age in Britain was maybe about 30, and now it's about 40. So it's a grayer society. Now, grey societies, I talk about the 4 greys actually. This will be, I think it's in the next book, certainly a speech I gave at the World Government Summit in Dubai earlier this year. The 4 greys are the grey consumer. So people are less innovative in their trying out new products. The number of consumers is shrinking. It's aging. the grey worker, so fewer workers, older workers, and we know both innovation and entrepreneurship are correlated with being in your 30s or 40s maybe, but when you're in your 50s, you don't want to be starting a business. You're less likely to invent something new or have a patent. Grey capital, that's more and more money in the hands of older people who don't want to take risks with their capital and probably want to lend it to the government, buy bonds rather than invest in private equity, say. So the a sort of furring up of the economy because you've got older, less innovative workers, gentle consumers, and capital looking for very safe home. And then the grey government budget, which is what I've talked to you about already. I mean, Japan, with its 250% debt to GDP ratio, for example, it's a product of the oldest society. I was looking at the data, and again, it probably depends how exactly you think about how you measure an economy. But I saw, according to one set of statistics, the UK economy, which is not, I think it's probably looking at the economy on a GDP, total GDP and not per capita, and we've had some population growth. Britain has not been brilliantly successful in the last 35 years and did reasonably well to 2008 and less well since then. The Japanese economy was not much less than 3 times the size of the British economy in 1990. And today, it's not much bigger than the British economy, despite having a significantly larger population. And we are no paragons of economic success. So there will be annual. You can't if you've got fewer workers and less innovative capital and less innovation, you can't get, however clever your fiscal and monetary policy is, you're not going to get economic growth. And I think we'll have, I think the next big crisis is going to be a crisis the next economic crisis will be a crisis of government credit. So
Mm-hmm.
governments are borrowing hand over fist, and eventually people will say, well, I'd like to lend to the government, I'd like to buy bonds, etc., but I'm really not sure with this demography that the government's ever going to repay its debt. And in the last crisis, it was in the financial industry, and the government came in as the lender and borrower of the last resort to keep the thing moving. If there's a crisis in one, like Japan, say, or France, I think it will be contagious.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say, well, hold on a second, it's not much better in Britain than in France. And if people then, now you could say, where are they going to put their money? But if governments can't raise money or have to pay ruinous rates of interest for it, so I can see huge pressures on the financial service, the financial industry, the economy, lack of workers. I mean, it's all very well to say, "Oh, well, it will be better if there are fewer people." But when you do get old, eventually the government will have to say, "We can't, we just haven't got the people or the money to look after you. Best of
Mm.
luck." So I think there'll be a lot. The villagers will lose their last schools and then the last people. The small towns, as I said, will start rotting away, and there'll be fiscal crises. It's not a very pretty picture.
Mm. Yeah, I was gonna say, Paul, you're not painting a good picture for
Well,
me.
it's what happens if we
Yeah,
choose not to have children. I mean, these are our
yeah,
choices. It's better
eh,
to paint it. I'm not saying it's
yeah.
inevitable. The baby boom came out. There was people like John Maynard Keynes were worried about the low fertility rate in the interwar world, and then there was a baby boom. It's not impossible. If I'm out there, obviously there's very little I can do by myself. But if we at least change consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
we move people on from the Paul Ehrlich view of the world, and they understand, and then we do the other things we can do to encourage them, to make sure that the culture shifts, that the economics shift. We can do all those things, and then we can turn it round. But if we don't turn it round, if it keeps going down, the fertility rate keeps falling, then it doesn't look very nice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everything that we've talked about today, it feels kind of like the people in childbearing years are trying to play chicken with the government, be like, hey guys, give me some policy breaks, give me some changes, then I'll start having the kids. And the government's like, just start having kids, you're going to do them anyway, and that way we don't have to do these policy breaks or give you this money. It seems kind of like it's a game of chicken to see who's going to break first, and then it's just going to lead to both breaking, or the government declining from lack of population, and then lack of population causing the lack of government support.
Well, you raised a good. First of all, there is a problem if you've got a large cohort of boomers
Hmm.
who actually vote, because that's what they just like. We got married, we had kids because that's
Yeah.
what you did, unthinkingly, and we vote because that's what you do. If the younger cohorts are smaller and less likely to vote, then the politicians are always going to be appealing to the boomers. So that's not
Hmm.
great. Um, and I think the secret is for governments to, I mean, you raised the point about short term planning in democracies, but I think governments need to think imaginatively about pronatal policies that will be popular now, even if they're not going to produce a workforce for 20 years. You can do things that are popular. I also think to understand that there are plenty of people of my age who are more interested in the welfare of their children and their grandchildren, their ability to get on the housing ladder, and than they
Hmm.
are in say, well, I want my house price to be boosted so I can feel wealthy. Well, actually, I'll stay in my house and then it will eventually be inherited by my kids. And it would be better if they got the money now than, so I think popular policies that encourage fertility, fertility now won't solve the problem for a period, but those policies can be popular now, and also appealing to the older people, um, who have children and grandchildren, which we mostly do because we were a slightly higher fertility cohort.
Hmm. My wife and I had this conversation after I spoke with James Ellis, and he talks a lot about the loneliness epidemic and how people aren't coupling up as much and stuff like that. And something we discussed was people assume that like they're going to be to the right time where they're like, okay, now it's time to have kids, like it'll feel right. But the reality is like there's always going to be something, or it's always going to be a challenge, or there's always going to be some kind of thing that you have to face, and you may quote unquote never be ready. And it's just like, if that's something that you want to do, you just have to decide to do it and then kind of figure it out along the way.
Well, obviously, it's a personal decision. Everyone's
Correct.
circumstances are different, and I'm not going to tell people when it's the time to have children. But I was sort of very impressed when I was 28. Actually, had been married for a year or two, and my wife, we were. I was a postgraduate student, and we were in a rented flat, and she just said, "No, let's just get on with it. No time will be perfect. Not in my career, not in your career, not in the. We can't wait forever. We'll never get to perfection." And I think. Um, it's incumbent on people to take a bit of a leap in the dark. But the more we can help them with that, the more we can give them security and a sense that they're not going to be out on the street. The worst case won't happen. I think most people who do have children are very glad that they did, and many people who don't probably regret it. I mean, the
Hmm.
data says generally people wish they'd had more children than they did. So, I think the part of the problem is this sense that this is cultural, that everything needs to be perfect before we can go there. And by the time it is perfect and you've got your mortgage down and you've got the right house and you're well established in your careers, it may be too late.
Hmm. Hmm. It's interesting. I think about my age at 29, and then I think about my dad's age. If when he was 29, already had 3 kids. I'm the oldest of 5, and then he was about to have the twins. And just trying to like think of the numbers in my head, I'm like, what? It's daunting. It's scary, but I mean, you
That's
just.
partly because you have different expectations to your father, and that's cultural as well, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, Paul, I really appreciate your time. I like to close every podcast with two closing questions. The first being, who do you think I should speak to next and why?
Oh, if you want to talk about these sorts of issues, Anna Rotkirch, who's a Finnish demographer, more serious academic than me, and a very will speak to her about this particular subject. I'm not exactly sure about the scope of your podcasts, or how wide, whether you want to do another number on this subject, but she would certainly be a good person to
No,
speak to.
I definitely do. I always say the podcast isn't named the Chase Merrill podcast because I'm egotistical. It's named because I'm not creative enough to come up with a name that can encompass all the things that I want to talk about. So
Right.
I just had to name it after myself. Yeah, I would love to talk with her. I'll have to reach out. The second is based off a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote. If we encounter a man of rare intellect, we should ask him what books he reads. What would be a book you recommend for me? And then where would you recommend we start with your books?
Oh, so that's assuming you've met a man of rare intellect. I'll take that as a compliment. Well, I'm actually, funnily enough, do I have it here? Yes, I have it, but it's balancing under my it's back because I need to put this up. But there's a book I've got here by Osterhamel called The Transformation of the World. It's a great fat book of the history of the 19th century. And I wrote to Osterhamel and said, I think it's probably the best history book I've ever read. So
Hmm.
it's very long, it's very detailed, but it's absolutely fascinating on how the world was transformed in the 19th century. For something slightly shorter on the same subject, I think the Richard Evans book, The Pursuit of Power, is
Hmm.
a wonderful book to read. Covers the same ground. Perhaps it's slightly more accessible. And if I can put a third book in, I would say read Malthus, perhaps the first demographer, at least in the Anglo. So read his first edition. So he came out with 6 or 7 editions of the same book. But really, the first one is a very parsimonious theory on how demography works and how it relates to economics. And then he developed it. There's more and more empirical stuff. And actually, you're not who's that interested in the Norwegian fertility rate in the first decade of the 19th century. So I would just read the first edition of Malthus, which I think is 1798 or 1799. It's quite short. It's a very neat theory, which I think provides a background. I mean, I think Malthus was wrong, but he was right up to when he was writing, and then things changed. So in terms of my work, first of all, I have a website, and on that I have lots of articles, and if people want to have a look at an article I've written, you can also find it quite easily. The demographic trilemma is quite an interesting one, something I did with someone called Philip Pilkington. In terms of my books, I always say I like to think that if I give you the title of the book, that tells you what the book's about. So let me tell you the titles of my 5 books. The 5th is to come out later this year, and choose what sounds interesting to you. So the first one, which was actually my PhD thesis, I didn't do my PhD till my 40s because I did my master's in my late 20s. I worked, then I did my first degree, work, master's, worked for a long time, had kids. And then when my youngest went to secondary school, I thought, oh, I could do a PhD now part time. So my first was my PhD, and it's an academic book, but I think it's quite accessible, though rather expensive. It's called Demographic Engineering: Population Strategies in Ethnic Conflict. The second one, which is probably the best known and has been translated into about a dozen, getting on for a dozen languages, is called The Human Tide: How Population Shaped the Modern World. And
Hmm.
that's about really the history of the last 220 years, based on the idea that there was a demographic transition and it had huge impacts on economics, politics, as it went round the world, started in the British Isles and went round the world. The third one, and if you want a primer on demography and why it matters in the world today, read Tomorrow's People: The Future of Humanity in 10 Numbers, which also takes the idea of the demographic transition, but instead of saying how did it progress through the world, it takes the world as it was then, like 5 years ago, and says, okay, where is the fertility rate still high and the population growing, and where is it now very urbanized, and where's fertility rate coming? So it kind of is a talk. And I did a TED talk on that, kind of covered that book, and also talked about the trilemma. So that was my third book. And that, as I say, is probably the one to read, I think, if you just want a quick overview of what's going on in the world demographically and why it matters and what the implications are. The one I wrote most recently was No One Left: Why the World Needs More Children. I think we've kind of explored that fairly well in this talk. And the next one is Bust: The Economics of Population Decline. So that's my bibliography, if you like. And if any of that appeals, all these books are fairly easily available, accessible, and except for the first one, affordable.
Perfect. I'll have links to your website and your socials in the bio or in the description of this podcast that people can check out. We mentioned before we started recording, you did briefly a podcast talking about some classics, literature classics. Where should people start? What's your favorite classic? As somebody who's starting to dive into the classics.
Oh, right. Well, that is a podcast I did with a friend of mine called Ed West, and it's called The Canon Club. And we just made 8 editions. Now, we did 2 on artists, Van Gogh and Caravaggio. We did
Mm.
2 on writers. We did Thomas Mann, and we did the Anna Karenina by
Mhm.
Tolstoy. We did something on Romanesque architecture. We did something on Shakespeare's Macbeth. But the two that I suppose were my favourites, because I'm a music lover really,
Mm.
were on Anton Bruckner, whose 200th anniversary it was, one of my favourite composers, big, noisy, long, transcendental symphonies. And we, for each of these, we got a guest. We got an academic who was an
Mm.
expert. And then the last one we did was on Shostakovich, where Ed persuaded me to be the expert. So I think the interesting thing about Shostakovich is, through the story of Shostakovich, you really can understand the story of the Soviet Union, and that was the kind of prism we looked at it through. So I would recommend, although they're both big, heavy, noisy composers, but I think although Shostakovich has his funny side and his humorous side as
Yeah.
well, but I would recommend getting to know the classics of music. And I think there is a link between the two, because I think we are part of a living Western tradition, and every tradition, every culture has to find its own meaning. But if you have a sense of the culture, the civilization, and for some people, the religion of which you are a part, and how you are merely a part of it and part of some longer, bigger continuity, then that itself can be a motivation to keep the thing going and make sure there's another generation to create and to consume all this wonderful cultural output.
Mm. Beautiful. Well, Paul, again, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure you're itching to go get your grandkids. My dad can't wait I'm the oldest of his kids, so he's always on me. He's like,
Okay.
I'm ready for grandkids. I'm ready for
Well,
grandkids.
good luck with that.
Thank you.